Okay, everybody. So, a warm welcome from the University of Portsmouth. We're coming together today to talk about and to promote our most recent edited collection to come out of our student engagement community. Thanks particularly to CEDA and to Routledge Education for commissioning this book and giving us the support to add another series of perspectives, best practices, critical reflections, and research relating to this growing field of student engagement and in higher education. So I'm delighted to bring together a lot of our authors today to be talking about a new edited collection that we launched 2 months ago, called Advancing Student Engagement, Reflection, Critique and Challenge. And this session today will give a sneak peek into about a dozen of our chapters that will be a feature in the edited collection, but also give a lot of our thoughts to the different areas for development, the different areas for critique, and the different areas of practice in student engagement in higher education. My name is Tom Lowe. I'm the editor of this publication, and I'm joined by many of our authors today. So to give a structure of what we're going to cover in this book launch webinar for the next hour and a half, we've got presentations from about 10 to 12 authors, and we'll have very short snippet summaries, and perhaps they're more like blurbs from the different authors from the edited collection. They'll be telling you some of their initial perspectives that their chapter covers, but also sharing some of their insights. We have a chat open. This is taking place on Zoom, so unfortunately there won't be time for a Q&A after each presentation. Otherwise, there'll be no way that we'd get through it all in an hour and a half. But please do use the chat as we go along to ask any questions you have for the authors or just contribute your thoughts on the topic. I'd be wrong if I wasn't promoting a conference I'm involved in running at the moment. So many of the chapters and many of the individuals who have conducted work in this space are people that we've heard of their work or we've met at the RAISE conference. And as the chair of the RAISE conference, which has been perhaps one of the big forums for bringing together the past 3 edited collections that have come out of the UK on student engagement, I really want to promote our national conference, which is taking place this September and is currently open for registrations, where we'll be focusing on a topic that has returned in prominence to the particular UK higher education sector, but the wider sector more globally post-COVID-19, where this event will be particularly focusing on not only talking about belonging, but also interrogating belonging, questioning belonging, and researching belonging in higher education. So that conference is currently open. All you need to do is search RAISE conference on Google and you'll find it, where we have over 80 sessions looking at the topic of student engagement, student belonging, and student success. So on to the edited collection and what we're here to talk about today. Well, I'm going to talk about there's 3 edited collections now that have come out of the networks of CEDA, which is the Staff Education Developers Association, and RAISE, both of which are based in the UK. So many of you know this publication. This is from Professor Colin Bryson, who was the founder of the RAISE network, called Understanding and Developing Student Engagement. And this collection came out in 2014, which I think has one of my favorite papers on student engagement in it, which is called Clarifying the Concept of Student Engagement. And this publication was really a response to student engagement perhaps coming to the UK as a great area of focus after decades of focus in other nations around the world. It has lots of case studies of good practice, talking about the possibilities around co-design, peer-to-peer support, and how we can look at enhancing student engagement in the curriculum. This publication came out in 2014, but many of the papers were written in 2012. So in 2020, we published a second book, myself and Yaz El-Hakim, creating a handbook for student engagement in higher education. This publication was largely written in 2018-19, unfortunately, all before the pandemic, where practice had moved on a long way. In those 6 years between the 2 publications, the UK in particular had seen new student engagement roles, student experience strategies, a whole host of initiatives of innovation and experimentation of engaging students as partners. And there was a real need to begin to share some of that practice, to share some of the thinking in different ways of engaging students in developing education. I would say on reflection, the book is quite evangelical. It says student engagement is the best thing ever, and it will solve all your problems and it'll all be fine. I think all of us in the space and on the call this evening who have looked at engaging students in higher education will know that it's more difficult in reality. Will know that there's complexities when you have students engaging in developing your education, or having students sitting on your councils or committees, or engaging quality assurance. And when you're looking at trying to improve higher education for students, often the conversation comes back to student engagement. But students are wonderful individuals who will engage in universities in a variety of ways and take lots of different routes through those institutions, whether that's engaging with the curriculum, the student union, the wider campus, or just the wider community where that university took place. So the book that we're here to talk about today is asking those critical questions. And a lot of this, the work in this book was inspired by putting together the MA in student engagement at the University of Winchester, where our second module, as part of that course, was all about asking those critical questions, asking about the critical challenges in regards to representation, representativeness, engaging a diversity of students in our work, what barriers can be put up in our practices, and how you do such things as measuring engagement, or whether that's even possible. So we aim to build together a set, edited collection that brought together a set of chapters, contributions, and sets of research, which brought together perspectives from around the world of individuals in the field who have really innovated in this space, have got lots of reflections from this space, who have read the scholarship in this space, and share that as what was very important to me, an accessible publication that wasn't just for learning and teaching people to read, or just those student engagement enthusiasts to read, but actually a publication that was accessible for a student union president to pick up, or somebody who was from another discipline to pick up, and that they could get practical solutions from right away. We are in the luxury space of putting this publication together across 2021. So we're able to respond to some of the challenges that have occurred since the global pandemic, though there are certainly more that are coming up every year. So I'm sure there'll be space for more work. We've also brought together some reflections from authors, like we have Jenny Mari and Stuart Sims on the call, who will be reflecting on some of these schemes that we've created. Many of your universities will have fantastic rep schemes, fantastic students as partner schemes, and on the tin, they sound brilliant. However, there's lots of challenges that now we have noticed years into these projects to think, how accessible are these schemes? How empowering are they really? And what promises do they make, and whether those promises are followed through? So that brings us to the end of our introduction of what we're going to do. And now I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour around many of our speakers for this afternoon, where they'll be giving 3 to 5 minutes on each of their chapters. And again, please do use the chat as we go. So I'm going to first of all hand over to Nathaniel and Alan, who will be talking about the first big challenge, which is how do we even research and evaluate student engagement? So Alan and Nathaniel, over to yourselves.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm Alan Donnelly, and I'm joined by my colleague Nathaniel Pickering. And we wrote this chapter with our colleague Liz Austin, who couldn't be here today. But we all work at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK, and we work in a central team called Student Engagement Evaluation and Research. So within our team, we support the delivery of our university strategy and the needs of our learning community, and we do this through the use of evidence-based research to identify and inform the development and evaluation of effective practices to enhance our students' engagement and their experiences. So the focus of that chapter is very much sort of based on some of the issues and challenges that we grapple with in our role. So in our chapter, we address the question of why and how do higher education institutions and providers research student engagement, and in doing so, we provide a methodological critique of data gathering approaches. So the chapter begins with a reflection of the current research and evaluation landscape of student engagement, both as a concept and as a measurement. And we observe that student engagement data can sometimes be collected within higher education providers without critique and without a clear rationale. And we make 3 main points So the first is that the measurement of student engagement can be challenging, and that could be down to the multitude of definitions and concepts that it can encompass within research and evaluation spaces. So, for instance, it could refer to student engagement as an outcome of an intervention, such as how students are engaging with their learning. It can refer to students' involvement in the design and delivery of interventions, and it can also refer to student engagement in evidence collection and the institutional processes. The second point that we wanted to make was that if we conceptualize student engagement as an outcome, so perhaps as a behavior change, there are often gaps in the evidence base about how the interventions are expected to enact those changes. And there's a tendency for the short-term outcomes to be prioritized and measured, which means that there are sometimes gaps in evidence between the relationships of those medium-term student engagement outcomes with some of the long-term outcomes, such as attainment, which is sought by institutions and the sector. And thirdly, we also observed a lack of research evidence about the impact of interventions on distinct student groups, which means it wasn't always possible to determine who has taken part or if any particular individuals or subgroups have benefited most. So in the chapter, we present 2 case studies that provide a reflection of how data is collected and used in our institution that provides insights into different aspects of student engagement. So as you can see on the screen, the first is an institutional module evaluation questionnaire, and the second is the UK Engagement Survey, which is a nationwide undergraduate survey. And both of these cases highlight some of the complexities about the purpose, method, outcomes, and the sample of student engagement research and evaluation. And we offer a critique about what could change to make them more useful. And we also consider what the rationale for their use could be. So the main focus is on sort of how those tools have been applied rather than just about sort of the design of the tools themselves. And you can read more about the case studies in the chapter. But I'll just hand over to Nathaniel just to go over some of the main reflections and recommendations that we provided at the end.
Can you move us on, please, Tom? Great, thank you. So the first 2 recommendations we make at the end of the chapter are really connected together or kind of flow into each other. And that's really questioning why you're collecting the data around student engagement, and is it the best method, and what are you going to use that data for? And what we found with our case studies is sometimes that rationale was just not there for the reasons we were collecting the data and how it be used. I think as a student engagement endeavor, even if we're trying to measure that, bringing students into that so that they're engaged in that process of developing those measures will hopefully improve them and make them more robust in the long run. And what we found is students are very involved in the design of interventions, but not necessarily the design of the evaluation of those interventions. And as we, Alan and myself and Liz are evaluators, obviously in there, what we really focus on is developing a theory of change, and that you should really articulate what your outcomes are that you're trying to accomplish. Our experience is that outcomes are not very well theorized, or that people are not very explicit about them. So when you're coming to then discuss whether or not an intervention's work and kind of developing measures for that, it's really challenging because you don't quite know what you were meant to be doing in there. I think one of the things we were really concerned, again, like Alan said, is that kind of awareness of different student groups. And we think really focusing on the groups you want to work with and understanding them will be really powerful. In some of the big institutional data collecting methods just exclude students by their very nature. So it's understanding which students are being excluded and how you can bring them into that process. But yeah, thank you very much. I think that's our time, isn't it?
Thank you so much, Alan and Nathaniel. Yes, spot on time there. So we're going to move swiftly on from talking about how we evaluate student engagement and engage students evaluation to talking about what perhaps is one of the largest areas of student engagement, which is engaging students in the curriculum and the challenges currently that are faced in engaging students in academic studies. So over to Sarah from the University of Winchester.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm Sarah Bayliss. I'm a psychology lecturer here at Winchester, and I really got involved in all of this when I joined Tom's PG Cert in student engagement some years ago. So the chapter that I've put together outlines some of the broader considerations about our notions of a student experience and its sort of relationship with student engagement in its different forms. So of course, including engagement in learning experiences, but also involvement in more broadly student life and the university community, and the kind of different challenges that we see, as was just mentioned, about different student groups accessing those different aspects of engaging with their university experience. So obviously, increasingly, our understanding about students' expectations for the experience that they're going to get when they come to uni needs to account for those changing characteristics of those students. And we very much celebrate the increasing diversity of our student body. But we also need to then listen very carefully to the different sort of challenges that these students bring with them when they join our university community. Most recently, of course, we know that our students are having to work increasingly long hours in order to afford to be at university. So many of them even sometimes working full time to be here. And then, of course, they need to balance those various personal circumstances against, so for example, family commitments as well, against their commitment to their study, but also their ability to engage more broadly with university life and maybe get involved in different interventions or opportunities for partnership practices. So, of course, then when we are thinking about evaluations, naturally students evaluate their experience against what they were expecting when they come to us and their individual circumstances and their individual needs. So, for example, did they feel supported? Did they experience a sense of belonging when they were with us? And we pick this up generally through our various evaluations and student satisfaction surveys, which we know are very limited in terms of what we can actually sort of understand from those really broad tools. So the chapter tries to address the way that we sometimes end up focusing too much on these outcome metrics, and how that then poses a real challenge, particularly, I think, for academic staff, because it creates this tension between pedagogical approaches that we know are good practice and sort of responding to some of that survey feedback. And it seems that students are increasingly favouring sort of more linear learning experience, where there's a sense of maybe efficiency between engaging in certain learning opportunities and not having a distinct outcome in an assessment, for example. And they perhaps are less likely to engage or attend in things that don't have that direct connection, but are actually designed to kind of bring that transformational experience of being at university and are supposed to help to kind of develop and foster that professional development and that getting ready for a sense of going out into the world of work and launching their own careers. And all of that also happening actually whilst addressing that increasing anxiety that we seem to see amongst our students about that transition out of HE and into employment. So we really need our students to engage with all of these different opportunities in order to feel confident and to build those different competencies that they are going to benefit from. So one of the points I try to argue is that actually one of the key things is managing student expectations while also fostering that student voice and really understanding where our students are coming from. You know, what are the current challenges that they're facing that we might be able to address in the way that we shape the experiences that we offer them, and to be able to align really with those diverse contexts that the students are bringing to their university experience. And I think another aspect which is really important, but maybe not as often addressed, is also listening to the staff voice as well. So both academic and professional services, because I feel oftentimes those are the members of the university who are kind of navigating the different challenges and tensions and are actually kind of implementing those strategies and those putting together those experiences for the students. So they're ultimately delivering that experience that's then being kind of measured and that we would want our students to engage with. So hopefully that was on time. Thank you.
Yes, Sarah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think when we talk about individual students and thinking what individual students need or want or how students will engage with higher education, I think that really draws us well onto our next chapter and talk from Maisha Islam, who will be speaking to us from the University of Southampton. So Maisha, over to you. Thank you, Sarah.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I hope you're all well, and Eid Mubarak to those who are celebrating. Thank you so much for having me as part of this lineup of incredible, contributors. My name is Maisha. I'm from the University of Southampton, working in the doctoral college to advance equality, diversity, and inclusion. So my job role really aptly matches the title of my chapter, which is all about equality and diversity in student engagement practice, positing the radical ways that we can advance racial and religious equity in higher education. Can I have the next slide, please, Tom? So to be upfront, my interpretation of equality largely centers on race and religion. So my chapter's main source of inspiration was directly correlated to the events happening in the 2020-21 academic year, which really verified the significance of race equality, even across international lines. So despite long-standing inequities affecting students of color, this particular year felt like an anomaly, mainly due to the dichotomy in rhetoric that was presented specifically within the UK. So this slide displays just a snapshot of key moments which stood out for me in relation to how issues related to race were being discussed, where there are more dates in the chapter itself. However, what you will see is this very stark contrast between governmental and university leaders and how they chose to respond to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. So universities largely showed solidarity, many for the first time declaring their support publicly and recommitting institutional efforts towards race equality. For example, we had Vice Chancellor David Richardson's remarks that all UK universities were / are institutionally racist. And whilst many universities vowed to reform curricula, confront racist histories, and voluntarily work towards national race equality schemes, governmental pushback was profound, from publicly shaming racially just theoretical frameworks to delegitimizing, decolonization efforts. I felt really anxious about how such a transitional moment for us in HE could result in sustainable transformation. Could I have the next slide, please, Tom? However, where Audre Lorde famously remarked that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, my chapter considers how we as student engagement practitioners can revitalize those tools to ensure that our work serves to challenge systemic inequality. So using examples to show how this is already being done excellently across the sector, I summarized with 3 key principles to turn the equitable transitions that we're seeing now and over the past couple of years into lasting transformations to serve our most minoritized students for the future. Firstly, I advocate for defining clearly the inequalities we wish to tackle rather than relying on homogenous or vague terminology such as BAME or ED&I. And in addition to this, our definition of minoritized or underserved groups should be expanded to include those not typically thought of, where my chapter details how Muslim students actually present some of the worst equality gaps in UK higher education, yet rarely receive institutional priority. Next, I advocate for decolonizing our practice, providing examples in the chapter of how we can connect our work and principles to already existing liberatory theories to guide our actions. Paying lip service to equity-related work ends up harming the very students who we are seeking to support. So I use the analogy of a 2-person rowboat to emphasize how working authentically with students to reach equity-related goals is akin to how 2 people's equal work in a rowboat allows them to move forwards rather than backwards or in a circle. And lastly, given the really hostile political climate we are seeing in the UK, the States, and elsewhere, I encourage practitioners to defend the resource, time, and efforts with students that is required to tackle our most systemic inequalities, particularly when these are being undermined, held to differing standards, or seen as a threat to quote-unquote academic freedom. We cannot morally let the momentum that's been built over these past couple of years simply just slip off the radar. And that's everything from me. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Maisha. And I think as we talk about political contexts, often the position of what students are told their role is in higher education can be enforced by the media or political perspectives on higher education. And I think that links us really well what Maisha is highlighting in terms of the political discourse around higher education, whether that's looking from a race angle or a decolonizing the curriculum angle, but also in regards to students' position as potentially a consumer of higher education. So now we're going to move on to our presentation from colleagues at Oxford Brookes University, led by Louise Taylor-Bunt, to be talking about students as consumers and whether that's a barrier to student engagement. And I believe, Louise, you've just arrived in time.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, so I'm going to present our chapter talking about this issue of the fact that higher education has become marketized, and there's this emerging new identity of students as consumers. And in this chapter, we look at the extent to which this may or may not be a barrier to students' learning and engagement with education. Next slide, thank you. So the emergence of marketization has potentially created some tensions between the traditional role of students as learners or scholars of their discipline and this new identity of students as consumers. And I think some of these tensions can be seen if we just look at a simple definition of a student versus a consumer, and how different that is in terms of where the whose responsibility and role it is to actually end up with the product. So if we look at a definition of a student or scholar, is we can define them as a person engaged in learning, person who studies, investigates, or examines thoughtfully. And this puts the onus on kind of the student or scholar as an active participant in their learning. If we contrast that with a consumer, we can define a consumer as someone who receives or consumes products or services. And this really emphasizes the more kind of passive notion of the consumer as this passive recipient of the product or a service. So I think there's these various tensions that we can see through these definitions between what marketization and how that the different potentially kind of tensions between the roles of students as learners versus the roles of students as consumers. Okay, next slide. So I've embarked on a kind of program of research in collaboration with many of my students, some of my third year project students and postdocs, looking at the different impacts of consumer identities on education using a psychology of identity framework. So we know that a stronger consumer identity is related to lower academic performance in students. We know that it's associated with students taking more superficial approaches to learning rather than deep processing approaches to learning. We know that a consumer identity is related more to more extrinsic motivations for learning, so wanting that end product of a degree, as opposed to really thinking more about the intrinsic motivation, which is learning for its own enjoyment itself. We know from an interview study with staff that staff who perceive their students as acting like consumers in the classroom perceive those students as having more kind of extrinsic motivation, and in turn that can affect staff's own motivation for wanting to teach for because they enjoy it, and it negatively affects their experience of that learning teaching relationship. The most recent study we've conducted was looking at the extent to which students identify as scholars or consumers and how that affects their experience, their satisfaction with learning. And students who are more have weaker identities as scholars of their discipline are more likely to be less satisfied, more likely to complain, and therefore take more surface approaches to learning. And so we talk about some of these findings in the chapter, and then next slide, then we present a teaching toolkit. So how can we start to address the negative aspects of students identifying as consumers and balance that out more with their identities as learners? So as part of the chapter, we present a practical guide, something that you can use with students in your teaching. It provides a structured space, either as part of like a tutorial, personal tutoring session, or a study skills module, where you can have a very structured conversation with students to establish what the strength of their identities as learners and consumers, have a discussion about it, and hopefully create a set of kind of principles or norms for behaviour, of ways in which to strengthen students' identities as scholars, of learners of their discipline. I think that was the last slide.
Thank you so much, Louise, and to colleagues. Thank you so much. So now we're going to move over to a presentation from Talia Adams at Lincoln Students' Union, talking about the different ways that we can engage students in developing education. There's a lot of dominance around certain approaches in our sector, but this chapter offers a more varied approach. So Talia, over to you.
Thank you very much. This one isn't my slide, so I don't know if it's the next one. There we go.
My apologies, Louise, you did have one more slide. It's all good.
You're okay. So I'm Talia, Vice President Education at Lincoln Students' Union until next Friday when I finish my 2 years in office. So over that time, I've had sort of these thoughts on how to approach student engagement, both from an SU point of view, but then also trying to work with academics in terms of the educational developments. And it's definitely an ongoing, I don't want to say battle, but there's so many different factors to it. Students are changing more than ever in terms of the different student groups. And I think that idea of consumerism definitely is coming through in our student population. So in terms of why do we engage students? I'm sure no one on this call necessarily needs to know the reasons why, but there is really positive, obviously, outcomes of getting students on board with developments, helping them to feel like they have ownership over them, and it brings about really kind of innovative ways of delivering content that is engaging for future students. So there's so many reasons why we should continue to engage our students. What makes students want to engage, that can vary, and I think more and more, and especially with the cost of living crisis, like we're seeing students being stretched for time, with the different student groups and maybe having personal commitments. It's not a case of every student's altruistic and wants to help the next year group, which you have to kind of battle against. So for some students, they do generally want to make an impact, but then that's balancing off with, if they feel like they don't get anywhere with their feedback, then they become disengaged. And that's something that, especially with, for example, like course representatives, etc., you have to be really careful with. And then for others, they want to see almost an immediate benefit. I think employability is becoming a stronger theme, but a lot of times it is that immediate kind of incentive, whether that's monetary or food is always a good one with students. So in terms of some of the ways that you can engage students, there's just a few areas that I've had experience with that potentially could be taken elsewhere. I don't think any of them are particularly groundbreaking, but just to run through them. So student representative hubs, that's where we would bring all of our reps together to talk about university-wide topics. Recently, one of the things that we had is around study space and what students would want to see. So that is a really good way of getting students engaged in that way. School action events is what we facilitate at our Students' Union, and we give sort of the range to the schools to arrange events, but our venues are there for them to use, and we can arrange food, etc. And it just puts a social spin on a feedback event, but you definitely do need the buy-in and time from the staff side of things to do that. Pop-up events, we've started trying to go to students rather than waiting for them to come to us. So we know that students have quite a high identity with like their school buildings, etc. So actually putting ourselves in those spaces and speaking to them can sometimes be more helpful, because even though in our situation our Students' Union building is huge, people still don't realise what we do always. So actually going to them is really important. I think an emphasis on sort of lecturer modular evaluations. Some students really just want to hear from their lecturers. They are not really listening to the things around it. And I know probably some lecturers are like, the students don't even listen to me. But like I said, it's a multifaceted approach in terms of how we grab every student's attention. And I definitely think, using lecture time as well can be helpful, frustrating from a teaching point of view, but actually students don't feel like that's their time if it's during a lecture. So if you can take 5-10 minutes to do questionnaire, etc., you might not get everyone doing it, but I would imagine you get more people than not, because they're there already. It's not on their watch necessarily. So that's always a great way of doing it. I think more and more online feedback applications. So we have something called CourseMate at Lincoln SU, which is an anonymous feedback platform. And we've just done our strategic review, and there was a lot around chat boxes and basically convenience around giving feedback and knowing that it's going to get somewhere and not necessarily having to go and tell someone in person, which I think is probably an aftermath of COVID. University meetings, always a good one, but I think they do have to be handled in the right way, because plonking a student on a university committee with absolutely no idea, no introductions from staff, it can become really overwhelming. So I think university meetings are good, but they need to be more accessible. So rather than just going through agenda items and expecting the student to jump up, unless they're really confident, then that's going to be difficult. So maybe more discussion-based topics, getting the students to come forward with those discussions so they have more ownership over that as well. There are some of the things that I think need to be looked at for university meetings, but can be a really good avenue to, especially getting all senior staff members in a room. It's a really good opportunity for students. More and more, we're seeing student written submissions. So obviously the Teaching Excellence Framework for OFS that came in was sort of quite a big one that we've had in terms of teaching and learning support, etc. And I think, at Lincoln, we have periodic academic reviews, which is very much on the same sort of indicators, but on a course level, program level basis. And there's a written submission for that. And I think those give students a little bit more of a professionalism because they get some employability skills out of it. But then the balancing act is that is time. They do see it as an extra workload. So where we can incentivize that, I think that's the best of both worlds, and making it into almost an academic opportunity so they can develop, but you're still getting really valuable feedback out of that. And then the last one was teaching and learning pals. It's something we did during COVID and we've carried it on. It's where we get staff member support services, professional staff members to bring proposals of different things. So whether that's an educational development, whether that's wanting to update their sort of mode of delivery for a certain thing. And we have students that are briefed with the papers, they get an Amazon voucher for attending, but we found really good engagement and it was focused, which meant it was more valuable for people that participated. So they're just a few ways that can be done. I think all of them have their pros and cons, and you're never going to satisfy every student's preference of feeding back. So you have to go about it in a multifaceted approach. But I think there needs to be more of a move to understanding that students don't necessarily want to just willingly give their feedback. In terms of it was something recently at my university rewriting something, and the way they worded something around you're expected to give feedback on your modules, and straight away I think for students nowadays that's just a turn off, because anything that's expected beyond their teaching is just like, I don't want to do that, or I shouldn't be told to do that. So how we kind of come across authentic and it's, make students actually feel like, yeah, we do really care about what you're saying. We are going to action it. We're going to tell you how you're doing it. But of course, that's easier said than done. And there's so many factors within that. But I think students are getting a bit more savvy with realizing when it's not authentic. So that's the thing that we really have to work on and make sure that we're trying to do to meaningfully engage students. Really sorry if I ran over that. I probably have.
Not a problem at all, Talia. Thank you so much. And as we talk about engaging students in development of education, I've started at the beginning to talk about how many different schemes have been developed in our sector, and that chapter really sets us up with a foundation for our next chapter summary from Professor Jenny Murray and Dr. Stuart Sims from the University of Greenwich, who will be talking about the control and the freedom of the structure of these schemes in student-staff partnership. So Stuart and Jenny, over to yourselves.
Thanks, Tom. So hi everybody, I'm Stuart Sims, the interim head of academic and learning enhancement at the University of Greenwich with my colleague Jenny Murray, who's our PVC in education. And despite of the lovely marketing shot of our Queen Mary building on our Greenwich campus on the front of the slide there, Jenny and I are going to talk a bit today and in the chapter about our experiences at previous institutions. For myself at the University of Winchester, and for Jenny at UCL, where we both ran change-based staff-student partnership schemes. So we had strategic oversight for different initiatives. At Winchester, it was a Student Fellows scheme. At UCL, for Jenny, it was the Changemakers scheme. And these were schemes that gave some funding, some resource, some support, some guidance to students to work in partnership with staff to change something about their experience. And Jenny and I have known each other for a long time, but found ourselves thrown together at the same institution and thought it was a good opportunity to compare notes, as it were, as organisers of such schemes, to think about what overlaps there were in our experiences as we had similar focuses, and think about what common challenges we faced, what common threats there are to this kind of work that we could share with a wider community for people to learn from. Next slide, please, Tom. So in having these discussions, we sort of landed on this discussion of pragmatic idealism, that actually a lot of work in the staff-student partnership space is very rooted in the critical pedagogies tradition of Paulo Freire and what have you, about how education for liberation purposes. And while this is something that Jenny and I were both very supportive, we talked about how a lot of these schemes that institutions set up, they need to be more practical. Sometimes that involves making some compromises, but we had a lot of discussion, and there's a lot of this in the chapter. If you're interested, I do recommend you pick it up, because we wanted to figure out where the lines of those compromises lie. At what point do you decide that you have to maybe toe an institutional line? And what point do you decide that some things have to be done in the interests of students that resist that institutional line? We talk a lot about the role of gatekeepers to these schemes, which Jenny and I both were on these particular examples, who are people who are employees of the university who manage and oversee these schemes, but that means they also govern entry to these schemes. And we talked about the differences of power and how you manage that within them, because these are roles which do hold a tremendous amount of power, and that means that they can unlock some structural problems which we may not anticipate. For example, how much harder it is for students to access things like room bookings or do printing, some very functional resource-based aspects of how you can change practice in a higher education institution. But if these gatekeepers aren't pragmatic, but with this idealized goal in mind, that they are a threat to the authenticity of the partnership in question. Jenny. And
thanks, Stuart. Do you want to go on to the next slide for me, Tom? Thank you. So we end up making a number of recommendations that fall out of the discussion that Stuart's just talked you through. And the first one is very much about being pragmatic to move towards the ideal. So as Stuart said, it's not that we're rejecting that ideal at all. It's just that our sense is that if you begin there, then you're going to fail to take people with you, and that it could end up being that you're working in a silo, not actually managing to affect institutional or wider change. So it's very much about being pragmatic, but not just being practical. Otherwise, again, you don't end up moving towards that ideal. So you've got to keep the ideal in mind, and you've got to work towards move towards that. And as Stuart said, there is a debate there about how much compromise do you make? Where are those boundaries of what you're not going to compromise on, and where perhaps you do need to? One of the things that we talk about quite a lot, and actually it's that fourth point there, is being prepared to work with people whose ideals may be different from your own. And if you're doing that, you need to be authentic in yourselves, but you need to enable them to be authentic. And we can't be truly inclusive if we're not prepared to work with people who are different. So it is very much, and I think partnership work itself is very much about listening and trying to understand other people. So Stuart said, we are trying to work towards institutional cultural change, and that is about making changes at structural to structures. So as Stuart said, it may be that staff have far better access to booking a room, to all those materials that you need for partnership work. And on a pragmatic level, if you were just being practical, you may end up having the gatekeeper or the staff doing all of that. But we've got to work towards changing those structures, or we don't work towards that equity that I think we're all after. We do need to put in place clear oversight and structures that reinforce the values of partnership, because of those power inequities, particularly with gatekeepers. And we do focus, because of our past histories as gatekeepers, a little bit on that, and the recognition that they have power over partnership. So we wanted a more democratic way of looking at that. And again, I think this is partly a reflection on gatekeepers. It's really important for them, but I would also say for staff taking part in thinking about whether you're supporting partners to make change, or whether you're socialising them into the expected norms and behaviours of the institution, because that's the way that you think they can make change. But maybe that's a short-term change, whereas what you're trying to do is something that's greater than that. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Stuart. And I think these last two chapters have talked about these initiatives and schemes that we've run, and that they are, even though they come from a very, very good place, there are lots of critical considerations that we need to have about how we are running these schemes, and perhaps some of the trade-offs as well. Whereas if we want to fund things and make things happen, we've got to be working with staffs in perhaps more of a project environment, but that perhaps can sometimes move away from maybe more of the emancipatory conversations about how to make education a better place. The next chapter draws on from Tanya at the University of Stirling, is looking at that tension between, as Louise started speaking about earlier, students as consumers and partnership, and whether this is possible at all in neoliberal universities. So Tanya, over to you for your summary.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, I hope my chapter draws on and connects nicely and chimes with the other chapters in this great book. And I tried to take a really creative approach. It was starting with the verb to make, and I was really struck by this in this initial question about thinking about to what extent can we really make students partners in neoliberal universities. So if we go on to the next slide, Tom, I focus on 5 different dimensions, looking at different definitions of the word to make. So to make could be to produce opportunities. And so I look at opportunities for partnership with students, not just making students a partner in a magical world and they're automatically there and a partner and willing to engage with us, but recognizing a bit of the process of this and seeing it as an opportunity, creating windows of opportunities for students to engage in partnerships with us. And a different definition of the word to make is to force students. And obviously we don't want to use brute or physical force. We don't want to force students into partnerships, but we do want to recognize the benefits. And hopefully it's more like a magnetic force of drawing students to entice them in with these opportunities that they see the real benefits of and actively want to choose to participate in these opportunities. And then I also look at a different definition, a different facet of the word to make, as in performing an action of partnership working. So I'm looking really at the benefits for individuals, but also some of these structural challenges that some of my other colleagues have mentioned here around university structures, processes, timetables, and even workloads as well. Then I also look at the facet of to make as in to cause or to become partners. And going back to some of the other themes that I was discussing earlier, I think this is very much a process, as others across the vast literature and as I've seen in my own research have seen it is a process, it is a journey of working with students, developing that trust, respect, reciprocity, empathy as well. But hopefully going on that journey together. And then hopefully there's a sense of success in that, but there's also a question, can we ever reach a successful sense of partnership, and what does success look like in partnerships? So how can we push back on the students as consumer rhetoric like others have talked about, and how can we recognize the benefits of engaging in partnership work and continually to enhancing our work as we want to move forward to make the student experience a better one. So I'll leave it there and I'll turn it over to others.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And I think that builds us up for our next chapter really well with from Alison and Gia from Bryn Mawr College, USA, where they'll be looking at enacting equity in higher education through co-creating learning and teaching. So Alison and Gia, are you there?
Yeah, thank you. So we work together in a number of ways, which we'll talk about in this short presentation. I just wanted to introduce the name of our chapter, Embracing Student Agentic Engagement and Enacting Equity in Higher Education through Co-creating Learning and Teaching. So we're going to kind of bounce back and forth between our two perspectives here, also trying to enact in this presentation faculty, student, faculty, and staff student partnership. GAE is no longer a student, but when we wrote this chapter, they were. And so that's what we're doing with this presentation as well. So we can pop to the next slide.
So there is a word that you will hear a lot that we'll talk about and its co-creation. So Bovill does offer this definition, which is very concise and very useful, which describes co-creation as shared decision-making, shared responsibility, and negotiation of learning and teaching. And there was a course that I was a student in and was the first part of our experience co-creating together called Advocating Diversity in Higher Education. And in creating my final portfolio for that class, I offered this extension on the idea of co-creation, really digging into the intentionality of it and the need, as some people have alluded to earlier, to create structures and mechanisms so that we can enable co-creation and kind of level that inherent power imbalance. So with that idea of co-creation, I think we're going to move on to the next slide.
So one of the other definitions we wanted to share with you that is really an important part of our chapter is this idea of agentic engagement, which was new to me, I think new to GAE when we started thinking about this. Actually, colleagues at another institution who do pedagogical partnership work had been focused on this idea. And agentic or student-initiated engagement is fostered through co-creation and can expand notions and practices of engagement to encompass student empowerment and equity, both within and beyond classrooms. So what's important here is the student-initiated part, right? A lot of engagement focuses on what faculty and staff can do to engage students, but the idea of agentic engagement is really making space for inviting, leaning into student-initiated engagement. Next slide.
So this chapter comes very much from our own experiences with co-creation, which come in two parts, but really three. So the first is in the more traditional positions of professor and enrolled student, where I was an enrolled student in that aforementioned class. And there were course assignments that were created so that we could actually think through and implement these ideas of how do you advocate diversity in higher education. And this leads to that second part where we worked with, or rather the students of the college worked to create this structure of teach-ins that really flipped the script on who got to champion and create teaching spaces. And then in the next semester after that, we took on the positions of co-facilitators of a course where we co-designed and redesigned an existing curriculum and the assessment approaches for the students who were taking that course. And this was also a hybrid semester due to COVID, created spaces with those students where they could then be informed participants and informed actors in creating what it meant to be in a course and to be assessed in a course. Next slide, please.
So you're getting the sense of a lot of layers here, right, of co-creation. I mean, there's the co-creation when GAE was enrolled, there's a co-creation when we redesigned the course and we situate our experiences in these larger, more far-reaching examples of co-creation that we just list here on this slide. So we give very brief insights into these forms of co-creation, including staff designing and redesigning curricular and pedagogical approaches with student partners who are not enrolled in the courses. So those student partners are in these sort of liminal positions. And that's actually how this course was originally created, with an undergraduate student partner and I who worked for a semester to create the course. We also talk about engaging in whole of course. This is what Kathy Bovill calls whole of class co-creation with enrolled students. And GAE just mentioned that all of the assignments are actually co-created with every enrolled student. We also talk about embracing course and program level co-creation of assessment approaches with enrolled students and not enrolled students. And finally, we talk about partnering with students in whole of program co-creation. So these are just multiple examples of the kind of co-creation within which we situate our particular partnerships. So next slide.
I think the benefits of co-creation, especially in a room like this, kind of go without saying. It fosters a sense of belonging, especially when we start to move away from student as consumer. so that students really feel like they have a stake in the learning community and a stake in the institution that supports that learning community. Co-creation also helps to redress epistemic, affective, ontological harms that are very common and almost inherent to higher education. I think something that we also spent quite a bit of time talking about is the barriers that do exist before we can get to true co-creation that allows students to stand on equal footing. And that comes down to power dynamics, as well as the fact that this is a very different framework than what is typically taught in most universities and colleges. And so if there is no progressive scaffolding to prepare students to be these equal partners, it is very difficult to immediately expect students to step into that role and feel ready and be ready to take part in this in an active way. Next slide, please.
So our last slide here is recommendations, and we go into much more detail, of course, in the chapter itself, but just to sort of give you a taste here, the first is to develop and foster in staff partnership attitudes, including epistemic confidence in students and open-mindedness to students' knowledge and contributions. The second is to consider ways that the forms of co-creation can be resituated more specifically within equity and justice-focused frames, and we elaborate on that as well. The third, as Ji just mentioned, is to scaffold co-creation efforts, perhaps starting with a more structured beginning invitation to co-creation, and then shifting or slowly removing scaffolding as students actively develop and exercise agency. As almost everyone recommends who does this work, take small steps, right? Start small, move on to sort of larger departmental, programmatic, institutional forms. Also consult the growing body of resources. I mean, people in this Zoom call are resources, they're conceptual frameworks and step-by-step practical guides that I and many student consultants and partners and colleagues have developed. And then finally, actively seek feedback and student responses to activities and assignments aimed at co-creation. So people have been talking about this as well in this conversation. How is that an ongoing dialogue, right, about this kind of work? That's it for us.
Thank you so much, colleagues there. So now we're going to move on for our next few slides to talk about student engagement and student staff partnership and engaging in student voice beyond the academic space. So when many of us read the works on student engagement and student staff partnership, you'll see a lot of it is coming from a curriculum space, maybe perhaps from an academic faculty member, author. So our next few chapters are going to be looking at the wider university space. And our first one summary is from Madeline George at the University of Worcester to speak about student engagement in professional services. So Maddie, over to you.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Madeline George and I'm a student engagement coordinator at University of Worcester Library Services here in the UK. So my chapter explores, as Tom said, student engagement in professional services departments, but has particular reference to my own experience working in a small student engagement team in an academic library. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in my chapter, I wanted to explore the quite often different relationship that professional services teams may have with student engagement activity, including some of the distinct challenges that we face engaging with students outside of the classroom setting. And I really wanted to focus the discussion around how professional services, so libraries like my own, but also services like career services, student support, everybody else who sort of supports that student journey. I wanted to think, as a lot of the speakers already have done, about how we define student engagement and also how we confront some of those stereotypes of transactional or perhaps even bums on seats approaches to student engagement that I think are being challenged, but actually do prevail, particularly in our area of the industry when you're talking about professional services in higher education. So I was also keen to look at how challenging it can be for professional services teams to even access students on a physical basis as a starting, if nothing else. And in particular, how tricky it can be for us to engage with what are very diverse student communities in an inclusive way when we're not getting that direct access to whole module cohorts in the classroom. But I also wanted to consider the challenge of measuring and communicating the value of this activity. Again, a theme that has come up an awful lot so far today and in the book, which is great to see. And really thinking about the value of this type of activity in professional services teams. And a lot of that is around convincing your institution, perhaps even sometimes your department, that student engagement activity is important. And also thinking about how we convince the wider higher education community that a focus on student engagement belongs absolutely in every corner of the student university experience. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with that in mind, this idea that professional services are, in fact, vital facet in the student experience, I have sought to outline what I think are some of the opportunities that we have to develop some perhaps more holistic definitions of student engagement that embed engagement at the core of professional service practice in higher education. And this chapter explores some of those definitions, as well as some models for delivering innovative and user experience led engagement activity. An activity that really values partnership within professional teams, partnerships with our colleagues outside, elsewhere in the university, academic colleagues in particular, but also especially values partnerships and meaningful partnerships with students. And finally, I wanted to include a case study of developing an impact framework that allows professional services teams, so like my own, to measure and to communicate the value of student engagement activity in our departments. And most importantly, I think, to advocate for inclusive engagement activity throughout our institutions. I think that's everything from me.
Thank you so much, Maddie, there for giving that case study example. And please all know, for those viewers who haven't got your hands on the editor collection yet, all of us this evening are giving summaries and introductions to our chapter. So if we leave you guessing, that's quite deliberate. Thank you so much, Maddie. We're going to go on to continue looking at the wider university space to Dr. Zachary Spire, who's going to be speaking about the university estate and the built environment as a whole.
Yeah, good morning, colleagues from Stanford. I started this chapter in conjunction with Tom, because he and I have had a number of discussions about the influence or the forms and the functions and stated purpose of the physical estate for student engagement. Originally, I focused on sort of the residential aspect of residential universities to sort of understand how that shaped how students accessed, participated in, and their attitudes and perceptions towards their engagement in and with the university. The chapter itself adopts some of the concepts and frames that Paul Temple, Professor Ronald Barnett, and Ian Solomonides out of Australia have proposed, basically reframing the university estate and the way in which we explore and understand student engagement in the university estate using a sort of multidimensional and relational approach. And in the multidimensional and relational sphere, I set out to explore and understand how different groups, staff and students, focus on different elements of their engagement in and with the physical spaces, often the learning environment, but also the more informal environments, where they live, where they hang out to have coffee talk, where they do their work on Zoom, etc., the library, etc. And I'm really keen to better understand how the presence of, or the lack of presence of, a physical environment or a physical estate shapes the way in which students engage in and with the institution and their peers, staff, and faculty as such. I left it at one slide because I wanted to keep myself to the 3 minutes. I really hope that when you if you choose to get to this chapter, that you find it, I hope, offers a way of opening up the conversation, as many of my colleagues have said earlier in this discussion, about trying to understand the range and nuance of those sort of engagement dimensions, rather than trying to collapse, reduce, or essentialize everybody's individual experience, that we actually open up the conversation to bridge the gap by asking people what that means for them and how they interpret it and then apply it in our own spaces, in our own institutions. And I hope you get something good out of it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zachary. And I just apologies for the lose of the slide for a moment there. We just had a last minute slide change from our next speaker. So Terrell is with us from Virginia Union University to speak on his chapter next, again, looking at the wider student experience and looking at that important topic that is very prominent, particularly in UK higher education right now, which is looking at achieving a student's sense of belonging. So Terrell, if you're there, over to you.
Yes, I am.
And I've included your figure. Your figure is right here for you. So.
You are amazing, Tom. Thank you. And to all of the fellow panelists, great hearing about all of the various chapters. So in the time that I have, I titled the chapter Widening the Aperture on College Student Sense of Belonging, a critical ecological perspective. Partly because, and I was so excited to get Tom's invitation to be a part of this project. I've written extensively about college student sense of belonging, mostly in a US context, but even with some broader understandings of how it happens in tertiary and post-secondary education. And we all know that there's pretty clear evidence that student sense of belonging is important, and it's a key to educational success for all students. So I talk about that in the chapter, but because my work primarily focuses on some of our most invisible, vulnerable, marginalized populations, I wanted to use the opportunity, the chapter as an opportunity to really offer an extension of existing models. So I call out the fact that everyone wants to belong. That's what makes belonging a basic human need. I even say a human right these days. And it takes on heightened importance in certain times and places where people are vulnerable to feeling alienated, isolated, invisible, marginalized, or even mistreated. And so we've got decades of research that really shows that it matters in education, and it certainly matters in higher levels of education. But what may deserve more attention is the role that belonging plays for particular student populations as they strive to make meaning of critical moments in education, and especially the role that the institution can play in fostering a sense of belonging. So over the course of the chapter, I review the literature, call out some statistics about our student populations, and then I use the metaphor of a camera to widen the aperture as we sort of fix our critical gaze on this notion of belonging and paying real attention to the role of structural, systematic forces that constrict and constrain and hopefully can expand and enlarge the campus bubble so that more students can feel included and celebrated. And I offer, as I'm going through this essay, talking about the critical ecological perspective on belonging, I'm offering anecdotes and data points from my own research. And one that I'll highlight is, and we can go to the next slide to see this in illustration, using this sort of model, I talk about interview data from folks like JB, that's an acronym, a pseudonym. It's a sophomore student who's talking in the chapter about his first year in college. So he's made it because he's now a sophomore or second year. And so he talks about how in his first year, college was difficult. It was rife with certain challenges. He was filled with self-doubt, faced some personal and academic setbacks. He spent a lot of time worrying about making friends. And so I use this to show that a lot of that is going to conjure up images and thoughts about what's happening at the individual level. It's the student worrying about making friends. It's the student who's agonizing over, failing a quiz and thinking that this may compromise his entire academic or college journey. But then I transition to show that, we talk a lot and write about belonging at the individual level, but in fact, there are institutional forces, policies, programs, practices, environments, and even structural histories to our institutions in the system of education that can be useful in trying to not only expand the campus bubble, but to affirm for students like JB that they matter. And so I tie this to how we can use, institutional programs, Summer Bridge, living learning communities, housing arrangements that will compel students to make friends, to get to know each other, that we can revise and revamp our policies and practices so that we will use language that shows students like JB as college material, refers to them as scholars, has them included in programs on campus. And so over the course of the chapter, I do that. And then at the end, I wrap up with where I'm going to wrap up in my talk. And that is to say, as a person who's written about belonging and published models on belonging, this is not, a rejection of previous models or of classical explanations. Rather, it's designed to supplement what we already have in the literature rather than to supplant it. And it does it in a way that will just call our attention to certain assumptions, like this idea of a level playing field, which really doesn't work, or these perfect hierarchies, or the linearity of some of these theoretical models that have very little resemblance to reality for our students. So I'm hoping that people won't say, oh, good, here's a new model, and then say that it's throwing out everything that existed before. It actually is designed to be a complement in a way that I hope does truly widen our view and perspective on a really important piece of the student success equation, belonging. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Terrell, and thank you so much for making the time as well. So we're coming towards our second to last talk, which is when we take a step back and we try to make sense of all of this, and we often reach towards models, as Terrell has just highlighted, and different figures or tools that we can use to gain a perspective of where we are engaging students or how we are making students feel. And this, the next chapter is from Simon Varwell, who's talking perhaps about one of the most classic models that we use in student engagement. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and hello everyone. I thought I'd simply use a picture of the first 2 pages of my chapter because it shows you everything I want to share. So I work for Sparks, Scotland's national agency for student engagement, and my chapter is all about Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. And that's the ladder you can see on the right of the picture. As Tom says, it's a classic tool of stakeholder engagement, and it was created in the 1960s in the realm of urban planning. And since then, it's been applied in various sectors to explore how people who use or experience a service are or aren't involved in shaping that service. For example, health, housing, and of course, education, where it's been widely used to prompt conversations about how students shape their learning. Now, you can see that the ladder has 8 rungs on it, stretching from the bottom, where stakeholders are manipulated into supporting what the authority was planning to do all along, through partnership to the top, where citizens are fully in control. And maybe some of those descriptions in the ladder chime with the learning experiences and decision-making you're aware of. To add some context to my chapter, in 2021, I completed the University of Winchester's Masters in Student Engagement, and I explored the ladder quite a bit in my studies. My dissertation included 2 things. First of all, a literature review of how the ladder has been used in various sectors, including higher education, and that was published as a journal article last year. The second part of my dissertation was a series of interviews with people from across further and higher education who have researched and written about the ladder or explored it in workshops. And my findings from those interviews form this chapter. So in this chapter, you'll be able to hear from my interviews about why Arnstein's ladder is still helpful for exploring student engagement over 50 years after its creation, what the ladder makes some of them think about the power structures that they're involved in, what they think the ladder reveals about structural inequalities in education and wider society, where on the ladder they would place the emergency decision-making of the pandemic era, what they think is the crucial but difficult space in learning and teaching where student involvement would bring about true partnership, the Valhalla and the Nirvana, as 2 interviewees described it, and much else besides that. I look forward to hearing what you think of it, and back to you, Tom.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Simon, and to all of our chapter authors that have made the time to come along this evening and to put together some more work for me on bringing together your chapters into a short snippet, which is far easier said than done. I just want to round off now with just some concluding thoughts and some of the key messages that came through the publication without giving too much away of what there is to be read. I think what we see across this publication is that student engagement, although it has strong support and has a positive reception by, I think, all stakeholders in higher education. That's conversations about student engagement, funding student engagement, researching student engagement, although it still holds very strong support and is a favourable area of focus in both universities and to the staff within. It is not a simple topic at all. And I think the complexities around how we define student engagement, how we explore and research student engagement, and how we talk about it is something we can't take for granted. Actually, the complexity might be something that we work through ourselves, but then we have to remember we have to take others on our journey as well. So that's one key message throughout. There's a real focus on the individual, and I refer to students as wonderful individuals. Every student is individual in their time, but we've got to make sure that although we're one thing that may work in one class or for one academic or for one professional service, it doesn't mean it will work in every other setting. And it might just be the time of day that makes one activity work with one group of students completely change its success. Gaining individuals' perspectives and the importance of listening to one another, having conversations, understanding one another, and being empathetic in higher education is critical to success in student engagement. And the context is just as strong in how much that contributes to those conversations and to what could work and what could potentially not work. I think stories matter, and as highlighted by Sarah right at the start, and built on by Maisha and then others, it's not just in considering the diversity of our students, but also the diversity of our staff. And we really need both parties to be considered when looking at creating perhaps successful engagements. We heard a lot about schemes, and we hear a lot about initiatives and models of engaging students in developing education in our universities and now across our sector, which I think is absolutely wonderful. And all of these initiatives come with the best intentions, and they come from a good place, and I think they should all be celebrated. However, we've got to be critically reflective of those initiatives, and because even with the best intention, there'll be lots of unforeseen issues, there'll be barriers for certain students to engage, and issues around representativeness. And that famous quote from, I think it was Catherine Bovell and Lucy Mercer Mapstone, says, just because it's open to all doesn't mean everybody can engage. So there is a need to be constantly critical of these brilliant schemes and initiatives that we are running, particularly around student voice in our institutions. We do have a chapter in the book, and I talk about it in our introduction chapter as well, about the growth of data analytics and the calls to measure engagement for either to offer support or to prevent student dropout. And in the digital world, and particularly which was even more catalyzed by COVID-19, there is an increasing want and need to let's look at the data, let's measure students' engagement. And I think we have to remember that we can only really measure behavioral engagement, and that's mainly digital engagement actually. And often if we only look at those digital measurements of engagement, that can lead to quite ignorant perspectives and certainly not valuing of the individual. I think partnership as a model or an ideal or a position is still very popular as well. But I think we see this across our editor collection and across our sector, that the partnership ideal, again, which we can get behind, may not yet be a reality in most spaces. So there's challenges and still work to do, I think, for those of you championing this in your home institutions. And then finally, I'd say there's still vast amounts of spaces to explore in this space. We may look at student engagement in developing education in regards to student voice and feedback. I think actually it's a packed field. There's been lots of work going on. Perhaps the work is done. We look at student engagement in regards to student staff partnership for pedagogical research, and we may think a lot of work has been done, but I'm sure people who research those areas will think there's still lots more to be done. But there is still lots of spaces, lots of uncharted territory that are underexplored. How we engage students in assessment and marking potentially is still very innovative. How we engage students in the recruitment of staff. As we hear in exactly. Sorry, someone's unmuted out there. And how we engage students in crisis management, and which we Jim Dickinson, who unfortunately couldn't make it this evening, has a whole chapter in our editor collection about how we tried to engage students in the COVID-19 response. So that does draw us to a close for this evening. So it's been wonderful to hear from all of our contributors. It's been excellent to hear everyone's perspectives, and great. Thank you for those who have engaged in the chat. If you want to hear more, please do get in touch with any of us. I'm sure all of our contact details are very easy to find online. But I have sent around a discount code for the publication, which is on screen there as well, and that will work on Routledge's website. So that brings us to an end, everybody. Congratulations to all involved in the publication, and I hope you all have a good evening. Remain engaged in our networks, and I'm sure the conversation can continue online. Okay, I'm going to close the session now. Thank you all for attending.